Hi, my name is Josephine, and this is my story of self. Circa summer of 2015, I was a socially aware, queer teenager in a small town in Wisconsin, and I got one of my first real jobs ever at an orchard in St. Croix Valley, which is a small town, even smaller than the one I grew up in. There's lots of farming, some old farming families, and everything was going pretty good towards the very beginning, but a detail that will become important later on in the story was that I was working with homeschool kids. And the reason why the employer hired them was so he could have them working year round rather than just seasonal, which is the kind of work I was doing. As you can imagine, small town homeschool kids, it can kind of be assumed that the reason they're homeschooled is because their parents are more conservative, possibly, and they don't want them to be exposed to things like sex ed, queer people, race discussions, accurate history, social justice, and things of that nature, unfortunately. So, not necessarily the most open minded people, and the workplace was very male dominated. The only girl about my age was not the type to speak up at all, and if I remember correct, her brother was working there as well. So there was that whole power dynamic. And the kind of leaders there were these 3 or 4 country boys, and they just talked about the worst types of things without having any real knowledge about them. I won't go into explicit detail because they did get pretty gruesome, but it was a lot of racism, very sexist, very homophobic, and they would kind of go into detail about these things like it was what they were having for lunch. So their attitude's very casual and joking, and their comments definitely reflected their values and their knowledge, and they talked about even worse topics than what I mentioned, if you can imagine. After probably a little less than a month putting up with this, I decided to take it up with the boss. And I asked him to talk to these kids that he'd hired for 4 years or more, these dedicated people. And I'd only been there a month. And one of his first responses was that they just don't have a lot to talk about, which was, in my opinion, a BS response. Each time I came back to him, his banter was very wishy-washy, and I remember only his wife, who wasn't very involved, seemed to take any interest. There was a lot of talking, but really no action that I know of, and if he did end up talking with them seriously, my coworkers didn't change. By the 3rd time, I ended up quitting the job without notice about a month in advance. Every single time I would ask him about those issues, he seemed to kind of already know what was going on, which was even more disturbing, but when we were working with him, he would join in and even make some racist jokes himself, so I got pretty much out of him what I expected. Even though it wasn't necessarily directed at me and they didn't know my identity as a queer woman, they were essentially microaggressing me with their conversation, and after a while, I began to have sort of these physical, psychosomatic responses to some of the horrible things they mentioned, and that kind of was the bubbling over point of me leaving. But nothing really changed, so of course I made the choice to leave, and it's also worth noting that I was getting paid Wisconsin minimum wage back then, which was over $7 an hour for hard manual labor and in 100-degree heat, that kind of stuff. The work, obviously, itself was not something that I had an issue with, or the environment physically. It was my coworkers. Because I was only 15, there wasn't a lot of weight on me keeping or leaving the job, and it was a summer job, so I could afford to buy a new laptop and save up money. I wasn't supporting or helping out my family at all. This experience definitely angered and taught me a lot, but it mainly highlighted what I already knew about the place that I grew up in. I'd never lived anywhere else, but since I was very young, I knew I was leaving Baldwin and Wisconsin for good, and I currently have plans actually to move south after college. I needed to go to my community in the Twin Cities, which was kind of my second home and always has been. People who wanted me to grow. So that's what I did my freshman year of college. and I needed to find my confidence to say something through whatever avenues I could access. I needed more skills to have these conversations that the high school speech competitions weren't cutting. They weren't cutting it for me. So there's a lot of answers to the why question, of why I have this passion and need to do something, to organize, to commune. Most of all, I've always wanted to protect people and give people and animals voices who aren't often heard, but also to give opportunities with my privilege to those who might not have access to that voice. So not only did this experience inspire me to move and to be around people who actually felt comfortable around, it also highlighted how important my voice is as a rural person who is open-minded and not bigoted is. And I want to highlight that a lot, because to speak up and to call people out, my existence is crucial in these spaces, because I know and I've seen and firsthand experienced some microaggressions and bigoted, hateful people, even within my own home at times. Disruption is, I believe, the main way to break cycles like this and to literally save people's lives in real time and over history. I have always felt that innate need for my life force to be a part of that, historical butterfly effect, if that makes sense. By changing or at least affecting people's perspectives, if I have the possibility to even, change somebody's mind and maybe even save somebody's life because I spoke up, that's what I want to do. And I know also how it feels to not stand up, because I've not stood up for myself and for people in towns like the one I grew up in. When younger me heard hate speech, I definitely froze up and was so shocked why someone would say and believe and act upon these things, even if they were calling me a bitch or a faggot. I wouldn't know what to do. I would know what to do, actually, but I felt too scared to do it. I'd been to, trainings and had discussions, so I knew what to do, but oftentimes I was too scared. I was more naive than I am now, as most kids are allowed to be. And Wisconsin is arguably the most bigoted, specifically racist northern state. So I've always kind of felt outnumbered. I've seen Confederate flags next to American ones on the back of people's trucks directly in my neighborhood. So, on my way to school, So it's right. I'm not making this up, It's right in my neighborhood. I guess it is really important to talk to white working class about literally anything. That specific type of person I have a lot of experience with, and I used to shy away from people in my hometown specifically, which is where my dad and his family have been for generations, so it's not something that I can take lightly, because I have so much history, family history in Wisconsin and Minnesota area. I used to want to block my blood relatives out of my life on both sides of my family, because they are them, that demographic of people who don't really go out of their way to educate themselves and don't want to be bothered. But that is also where my dad certainly grew up in. He was raised on a very poor family dairy farm. And my mom, to some extent as well. So this experience and many more helped me realize more deeply that they are the exact type of people I need to be talking to, because they're probably, unfortunately, going to listen to me a little more, because I know the little nuances of how to talk to people from small white towns, quote unquote. But even in that, I'm still a 5'2" woman who's usually visibly queer, so that's always on my mind. Reflecting back on this specific experience, I also think about how young I was and how aware I was that what they were talking about was wrong. I wonder how my age affected my decision and how my mom's presence affected how I responded, because she's a social worker and she was able to give them resources. So it's like our argument per se was strong, and now I'm 22, so I'm reflecting. It's made me definitely see my place in the race conversation and the sex conversation and the gender, social justice conversation, etc. And also those identities and how they intertwine. It helped me see when I should shut up and when I should talk in those convos, and if I should talk and when. It's helped me develop my personal perspective and solidify my identity and my belief system. It's helped me be more emboldened. Once in a while I have spoken up, and I realize that there are more people like me than I thought around me, depending on where I am. But it can still be very scary because I tend to always feel outnumbered. But even because of the experiences and what they've taught me, I have some amount of hope. And I'd like to leave y'all with an image that has kind of stuck with me from leaving this job and this experience. And it's the loyalty my ex-boss had to these kids, these boys and these men who weren't even his by blood. And how he was apparently so horribly unaware of how his reactions and actions affected the community and the wider community and thus the world. One thing that really stuck with me kind of emotionally was that I felt almost powerless in that situation because he was so complacent and I couldn't change the status quo there. It was the reaction of a fully grown man and his complacency in these discussions, but also the multifacetedness of this issue. He relied on these people for work. They had loyalty to him. This experience with this powerful, grown, white, cis man, he chose to use his power over everybody else in a negative way, and I chose to use what little power I had to attempt to stand up for myself and the people I essentially represented in that moment. He decided to go one way and me the other in Spring Valley, Wisconsin in the summer of 2015. Thanks.